Welcome to our Biz Huddle podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Cuthbert, Creative Director at Baker Creative. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please hit subscribe so you can get notified when new content comes out. Please share this with anyone who could be inspired by it. Colleen Marshall is the anchor of 3 NBC4 evening newscasts and the host of weekly political programs, NBC4 The Spectrum. She joined NBC4 in 1984 following assignments at a television station in Wheeling and radio stations in West Virginia and Pittsburgh. A graduate of Point Park University and Capital University Law School, Colleen is a practicing attorney. She has been honored by the Alliance for Women in Media Foundation, Associated Press, Ohio Society of Professional Journalists, Media General Stonewall, and Ohio Valley chapter of the National Association of Television Arts and Sciences, winning 8 regional Emmy Awards. She has been recognized for her community service by numerous organizations. Welcome, Colleen. I really appreciate you coming to our podcast, and I think a lot of women and working professionals are going to get a lot out of this interview. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So I've always been fascinated by your journey between all these different roles that you play in the community. Can you shed some insight on how that kind of came about?
Well, it's taken a very long time. I in this community, I came here 38 years ago, nearly 38 years ago. I don't know if you want my life story or my community story, but I'm from a small coal mining town in Appalachia in Western Pennsylvania. But it's a place where most of the mines had dried up. My mom had active mines when she was little there, but grew up there, went to college in Pittsburgh at a college called Point Park, majored in journalism. I had always been fascinated by journalism. I was a Watergate freak, one of those kids. And studied journalism, married my husband, and I met the first day of school, our freshman year at the school, at the freshman orientation party. We married a year after graduation. He was a photography major, and he got a job as a television photographer at a station in Steubenville. I had been working at a radio station in Pittsburgh, an all-news radio station, as a writer and producer. And we moved to the Steubenville area. I got a job at a small, tiny station in Weirton, West Virginia. From there, went to a radio station in Wheeling, West Virginia, went to a TV station there, and was only at that TV station for about 4 months when my husband got a job at Channel 4 as a photographer here in Columbus. So that's how I got to Columbus. I followed him here. I interviewed at all the stations and was offered a job by Channel 4, luckily. So he and I worked at the same station for a number of years. He left in '98 and started his own home remodeling business, but I'm still there. They made me the weekend anchor. In '92, they put me on the anchor desk with Doug Adair. Mm-hmm. And when my kids were probably in, I guess, 8th, 9th grade, when my son turned 13, my husband said to me, "Do you know, we were exactly 5 years older than him when we met?" And I started thinking, I've always wanted to get a second degree. I thought maybe I'd get a master's in journalism, but that's not very practical for what I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And I always had an interest in law. So I went to law school while the kids were in high school. Took me 4 years instead of 3 because I went part-time. So then I became an attorney. I worked at Porter Wright for a few years. And of course, throughout that entire time, I've been at Channel 4. I worked at Porter Wright for 12 years. Then I did family law, domestic law for about 4 or 5 years. And now I'm just basically doing appellate work, working for myself. Got to be a little bit much. A domestic practice is very demanding. Mm-hmm. So that's the thumbnail version of how I got to where I am. Of course, I'm also very committed to a number of community organizations here in Central Ohio. This community has a big heart. And it's good because there's also great need. And I've been very active, especially the past several years with the Alzheimer's Association, because of my mom died of Alzheimer's in 2015. And I've worked with them for more than a decade. And I'm going to get a plug in. Can I get a plug in?
Oh,
I'm heading the Alzheimer's Walk in September with Greg Murray and his wife from he's the voice of the Blue Jackets. So if you can, I'll have stuff up online to support the Alzheimer's Walk. Okay, that's my life story. See ya.
No. There's much more to find out. So then, doing all these different things, how has your career being a journalist assist you being an attorney?
It's so interesting that you should ask that, because most people think that it would be a conflict. When I first worked at Porter Wright, I worked in the corporate litigation department. So basically, it's the kind of cases where businesses are suing each other or they have some kind of a legal conflict. And I worked very closely with an attorney by the name of Kathleen Trafford. She's one of the leading attorneys here in Columbus. And she's a brilliant woman. And I was lucky enough that she served as sort of a mentor for me. And she was an attorney who knew the law forwards and backwards. And when you argue a case, she'd say, it's the law, the law, the law. Well, I'm a storyteller. And I thought, you can persuade a case. She'd say the facts section has to be, not as long, not as detailed. And I would argue, no, it's the facts. If we can tell the story right and then apply the law. And so I think I worked well with her because we each came at it from a different background. And I think being a journalist enhanced my ability to tell the facts. Now, I had to work on the law a little bit to be even a fraction of astute as Kathleen Trafford is. But I think that being a storyteller, I think that when you go to court, when you were before a judge, you are there to tell your client's story in a way that is persuasive and accurate and factual, but their side of the story. And so I think being a journalist helped me with that. And I think the law, it makes you think differently. It makes you look at all sides of an issue, because you don't know which side of that issue your client is going to end up being on. And you also have to be ready to argue against whatever case they are presenting. You have to know all sides. And being in a newsroom, when you tell a story, you really need to know all sides. You need to hear from everybody involved in that story and be fair and accurate and balanced in the way you present it, almost as if the way you would want a judge to be. You want the judge to look at everybody without a bias, to come in asking the tough questions and wanting the accurate presentation of the facts, but being fair and balanced. So I think in a lot of ways, these two careers really enhance each other.
I love that. I mean, I have an in-house research lab and we do the same balance thing, because otherwise you don't know if you're approaching it correctly. Right. And I think anyone who would want to hire a lawyer or trust someone in the media, that's super important. Yeah. Because people, that's where you get your credibility from. And I'm sure that's why you've been so successful on both parts.
But I'll be honest, sometimes you go in and you believe one side more. Yeah. It's hard to guard against having a bias. I can think of a case that I've worked on extensively over the past few years that I've won awards for, which is the Strauss sex abuse victims at Ohio State. I've gotten to know a number of these men, and I find their stories to be very credible. And so did the federal district court judge who was hearing their case. The judge said in his opinion that this whole case comes down to the statute of limitations, because this happened long ago. Dr. Strauss left the university in '98. The statute of limitations on a sex abuse case has expired. They're trying to get an extension. The victims are trying to get an extension of the statute of limitations, or a recognition that sex abuse victims sometimes it takes them decades to be able to say that, especially young men who were sexually molested by someone who had power over them. So it's I really find myself, I have to represent the university side of this, but it's hard to do because their side is not very sympathetic. And this fight against lifting the statute of limitations is leaving a lot of people who were victimized high and dry. So, but I've tried very hard to also say, this is what the university says about this. This is what lawmakers say about this. This is what the law says. And here's what the victims have to say.
So do you find yourself, when you report so many tragic things every day, how do you deal with that? Because that can be draining.
It's draining, and I'm someone who worries a lot anyway. I'm one of those high anxiety people, and my children would tell you that my job affected the way I mothered them because of my worry. If they were out in a car, how many car accidents I've had to report on, and I would really worry. I was always afraid something bad was going to happen because so many things that are bad happen. And they laugh about it now, but I'm sure it was annoying when they were teenagers and had their mother who, we'd be sitting live on the desk and we'd go to a traffic reporter telling us about some accident. If it was on this side of town, I live in the Hilliard area, I would be trying to see, is that one of my kids' cars? Is that my child? You can't get away from life and the harsh reality that you're reporting every day.
Yeah, I heard that from multiple people that's been in the media. It's very difficult to disconnect between what they see at work, because sometimes you have to say it so many times, even in an hour. And
right. And then the other thing is, strangely enough, so much information passes through your head on a daily basis that, I might read a story several times and 2 days later, forget the story, forget who it was, where it happened, because there's more information coming through every day. It's a lot of information that we process on a daily basis.
So then how did you translate that into the Spectrum program? How did that come about?
Well, there a former producer who became the executive producer and then the assistant news director. His name is Chris Booker. He now works for The Ohio State University. But back then, and this is how long ago we started it, it was when John Kasich and Ted Strickland were running against each other. He and I had just a great interest in politics. And it's funny, in a newsroom, you either love politics or you're like, oh, I don't want to cover politics. I've always loved politics. I mean, seriously, going back, I wasn't making a joke about that. In high school, I was so fascinated with Watergate. That entire process of these two reporters from the Washington Post who toppled an administration. I loved watching the hearings on TV. I one time had my mother, I said, I've got to stay home, Mom. There's an important day of testimony. And I never missed school. She said, you're going to stay home for the hearing? And I said, I need to see this testimony, like I was part of it. And so my mother would never lie. And so she wrote a note the next day that, please excuse Colleen for being absent. There was an important day of testimony in the water. And I had to carry that note to school because she said, I'm not going to lie for you. And I had to carry that and hand it to the office. And this woman I remember her looking at me like, what kind of she was like, oh, okay. But anyway, now I forget what I was getting to. Oh, the Spectrum. So I've just always loved politics. Well, Chris Booker was the same way. And he and I, as it turns out, were kind of different political backgrounds. And we had different perspectives on things. And we would argue sometimes about politics. And sometimes we would, we just had these conversations all the time. And I said, we should be doing a political show. And he really liked the idea too. And so we pitched it. And the general manager we had at the time, he was actually just an interim general manager, but luckily he also really liked politics. And so we started this show, and we started it I followed John Kasich around on the campaign trail for a couple of days. Then I followed Ted Strickland around, and then we put together what I think was really a good program with these two. And they didn't know where to run it. We also didn't have a name for it. I wanted to call it, are you ready for this? I thought it would be funny to call it Strange Bedfellows. And nobody would let me do it. Hey, that it sounds like a porn site.
Hey, well, you know.
So then we kicked around some names, and finally I said, I like the name The Spectrum, because we want to do all sides of the political spectrum. So that's how it started. So when we first started the show, I don't know how many years ago, it was like, what was that, 20 years ago, nearly? But when we started it, we they had a time slot early in the morning for it. At that time, I think it was Chris Matthews had a show, and we bumped his show to an hour or half hour earlier and went in. And at first the sales department was so mad at us because they didn't want, they were like, oh, we get money from that Chris Matthews show. Well, then so many people started watching it like at 8 a.m. that they then slid the Meet the Press from 10 to 10:30 and put us in at 10, which is a pretty good time slot. And we've really over the years liked it. I've had a couple of producers. I've got one now. His name's Nick Bechtel, who's also loves politics, who's very creative, comes up with stuff that I really like. And there's the guy by the name of Alex Smith, who's an editor, who has really upped the look of this show. It's so important to have a really good team. I think anyway, he edits, he finds things, and he's graphics flying in, and just makes it a more interesting show. So that's how it started. And where we are now is still each week trying to give both sides. Sometimes we do things a little different. For example, this Sunday on, I don't know what date this podcast will air, but on Easter Sunday, we are doing an interview with the brand new bishop, Earl Fernandez, who's coming to Columbus. I sat down with him, and he, the thing I still like about this business is you just meet fascinating people. He's got an amazing story. He's his parents were immigrants from India. He will be the first Indian American to be a bishop in the United States, and the first person of color in the Columbus diocese. And so I'm sitting down with him, and he's got a fascinating story to tell. And talk about a smart family. He said his mother they used to say their prayers, and she would say, pray that you're a smart boy, a tall boy, and a doctor, because his dad was a doctor. 3 of his brothers are doctors. One of his brothers is a lawyer, and he went to medical school and then felt this calling to the priesthood and became a priest. And so the other thing he told me that I thought was funny, he said, a doctor, a lawyer, and a priest walk into a bar. He said, it's not a joke, it's just my family.
That's hilarious. That's so funny. And he's got a lot of energy, and I think
right,
need that lightness now. It's
yeah, he's a good guy, and I was thrilled to meet him.
Aww. So hosting the show, was there anything that kind of really surprised you throughout the years?
Yes. And I this is almost like a behind the curtains surprise. We each week at the very last segment of the show, we have what we call our roundtable. We have a Democratic strategist and a Republican. And we've tried to find people who are connected deeply to their parties, who have passionate feelings about the way the country's going one way or the other. And we sit at this table, and I will ask the same question of both sides, try to get their perspective, question them on the veracity of what they're saying, because sometimes they just say things that aren't true, and you can't believe what people are willing to go in front of a camera and say. So I always feel like I better know before I ask this question, I better have an idea of what the answer should be. But they will argue and call, not call each other names, but basically, argue that you don't know what you're talking about. And sometimes it gets a little heated. As soon as we shut the camera off, hey, what are you doing this weekend? And they're very friendly with each other.
Oh.
And very, they have long, so we used to say we should keep rolling the camera and call it Spectrum After Dark. And let people hear, because that's when the conversations get very raw. And I will use as an example, just because it's the easiest example, Donald Trump has been very divisive. Mm-hmm. And there will be some members of the GOP who will on camera defend him and off camera not. And so that's when you see that you have, sometimes these guys, I believe, feel like they have to toe the party line, because they have clients, a lot of them are like strategists and campaign managers, and they do that for a living, and they don't want to be on the record going against the party line. But you realize they don't always, and not just Republicans, Democrats the same way. Some of them trying to defend Joe Biden's economic policies off camera will say we're in trouble. Mm-hmm. So it goes both ways. And I think that's the thing that I have found to be surprising.
If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please hit subscribe so you can get notified when new content comes out. Please share this with anyone who could be inspired by it, and feel free to post any questions so we can be inspired by new content. Thanks for listening. If you're interested in learning more, visit our website at bakercreative.co.